This, was basically months and months of being isolated with about 150 people at McMurdo Station. And I believe there was 43 of us at the South Pole when I was there.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons, author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I will be your host today. Some of you may wonder why, at a time when much of the world is burning up from heat and wildfires, we're focusing on Antarctica. And we will find out the answer to that later in the program, as I'm very happy to introduce our guest today, our very special guest today, Ray Sundby. Ray, you have been, as I understand it, the winter season facilities engineer deep in Antarctica at what I understand is called the McMurdo Station. If I mispronounced it, you will correct me. I'm sure you've had a remarkable few years there with lots of interesting observations and stories that can basically tell the viewers a kind of a firsthand peek, if you will, at the conditions in Antarctica, what the work was that you and your team were doing there, and how it relates to the climate crisis and the climate emergency. So we thank you so much for you being with us today. And please, as always, like and subscribe to this channel. Go to our website, climateemergencyforum.org. We would appreciate your donations so we can continue this important work. Leave us your comments and questions. Make sure that you listen to our podcasts and basically continue being a loyal viewer of the Climate Emergency Forum. And as always, we invite you to stay to the end of the program when I will be briefly talking about what we call the Climate Three of the bigger climate stories of the past week, each presented in 1 minute or less. So with that, welcome, Ray. I assume that the picture behind you of the blue skies, that you're not live in the middle of Antarctica, but wherever you are, tell us where you are and give us a little flavor of who you are and how you wound up in Antarctica.
I have been in Antarctica for 4 winters, about 10 months at a time at McMurdo Station. And my last deployment was to the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. So a lot of experience down there. I have done volunteer work most of my adult life of various kinds. I have a degree in electrical engineering and an MBA, and I'm an honored listee with Marquee Who's Who. I have worked in many parts of the world doing contract engineering, consulting, and related work. I have been in the Bay Area of California now for about 10 and a half years. My early life was in Chicago, Illinois in the US. And then I moved to Wisconsin, just north of Illinois, and went through my high school and college years there. Then moved out to Colorado, where I did work as an engineer and did a lot of volunteer work. Some of the volunteer work I've done over the years includes work as a technical mountain rescue volunteer in Colorado. I've been a volunteer fire chief in the mountains of Colorado in a small rural mountain fire protection district. I'm currently doing trail maintenance for California state parks, including chainsaw work. So a lot of volunteer work. A little bit about my work in Antarctica. The reason for going there is the Antarctic Treaty and the U.S. work there will lead to broader cooperation among nations as we promote environmental stewardship and preserve our planet. So that's kind of the whole reason for being down there. Broader cooperation among nations, I think, is important. We interact with other stations down there from all over the world. So it's an important mission. When my time at McMurdo started, I had been unemployed for about 9 months because I had been doing consulting work and a change in the economy in the US. All my work dried up, and spent about 9 months, 40 hours a week in job search, and had to go to the other end of the planet to get a job. So that's kind of how I wound up being down there.
tell us what surprised you. Tell us what our viewers would like to know about life in Antarctica.
Well, life in Antarctica in the winter is cold and dark. McMurdo, it's cold and dark, and at the South Pole, it's colder and darker for longer. I think that a lot of things were like I expected. The work I was doing was very interesting. As the facilities engineer, I had technical responsibility for the station I was at. And of course, there were skilled trades people there that managed maintenance and repairs and things like that. There were a lot more parties and recreation there than I had expected. Midwinter there is a very big deal. There's a former dinner, there's a polar plunge, there's a big 4th of July celebration where they had things like dunk tank and a pie in the face and Cheetos diving in a big box of Cheetos for something lost in the bottom of this box, and human Jenga where they stack boxes. You get on a box, somebody hands you another one, you put that on top of the box you're on and get on that, and so on up to as high as you can go. And then the only way off is to fall, and you're, of course, on rope and delayed. The boxes go everywhere, and then somebody else tries it. So that was a lot of fun. I did volunteer work down there. I was a volunteer peer counselor. Most people adjust fairly well, but some people don't. They have seasonal affective disorder, or they have family emergency back home that they can't get to, and so on. I was also a volunteer mass casualty medical team lead. So some of the volunteer work I did down there. So that, I think, covers a lot of things. I'm sure you have many more questions.
I hope you did not have to activate that disaster team.
There were a couple of minor things. There was a fire in one of the buildings. Didn't go very far, but no major disasters when I was there, thankfully.
Well, that's good. Obviously, good to hear. All right, let me turn it over to Paul. Paul Beckwith, as our regular viewers know, is a climate system scientist from Ottawa with a popular YouTube program. Paul, floor is yours.
Thank you, Herb, and thanks, Ray. Maybe you can give us an idea of like the scale. I mean, I found the Wikipedia page on McMurdo quite informative. You can look up 146 buildings, a harbor. The base is built on bedrock. There's a port. Sometimes icebreakers have to go and break up the sea ice, but it is accessible by ship. I'm sure NASA is, using it as sort of an analog. Like if we ever did have some moon base in the far future, it's like we're talking about 1,100, 1,200 people there in the summer, winter, 200 odd people, many scientists doing experiments, not just on ice coring and weather extremes, but also on meteorites. Great place to collect meteorites. You can see them on the ice. Ozone layer studies. I mean, they put up balloons. Like it's really a community, a whole community. Had you been in small communities before, or was this kind of all new to you, really?
This was actually pretty new to me. I spent a little bit of time, on a canoe trip in northern part of the U.S., and we were isolated with a group of 10 or 12 people, but that was only a couple weeks. This, was basically months and months of being isolated with about 150 people at McMurdo Station, and I believe there was 43 of us at the South Pole when I was there.
I assume you had quite a bit of interaction with scientists. Does some of their work come to mind? Like, I know there's a lot of ice drilling, is a really big thing, but that's inland. Like this is right at the coast, and it's not very high above sea level, from what I understand.
So we did have quite a bit of interaction with scientists. There was always one or more scientists that would give a talk weekly about what they were doing and try and get it down to the level where us normal people could understand it, which took quite a bit because there were some amazing people down there. At McMurdo Station, there was a lot of ice diving that went on. One time I was an assistant in the little building out there that, helped the divers get their gloves and stuff on. And, they would go down for, as long as they could stay warm in their dry suits and then come back up and they would collect samples and so on. There was weather balloons that went up that did kind of a circumpolar navigation and came down fairly close to the station again, or the data recording was ejected fairly close where it could go be picked up after they'd been up there for a while. So that's some of the things that went on down there. At the South Pole, they had a project called IceCube, where they put a cubic kilometer of thousands of sensors into bores in the ice to detect high energy neutrinos that had come through the planet. And they would detect a few of those a year, I think.
Let's shift over to Peter. Peter, you are a retired medical doctor from the west coast of Canada. You have the Climate Emergency Institute that you started, and you have been an expert reviewer for the IPCC. Welcome as always, Peter, and the floor is yours.
Yesterday, I looked up, news and looked at the maps for Antarctica to see whether there was anything new. And I came across this neutrino thing. I tried to understand it, but I doubted if I could, because they seem to be explaining that this is actually a new way to detect neutrinos in outer space in order to find out whether there's any problems in outer space. Excuse me laughing, but I'm pretty well focused on the problems on this planet Earth right now. We've been interested in the Antarctic sea ice, of course, so if you have any news on that, I'd be very, very interested. The temperature in Antarctica just goes all over the place. Recently, it was a very high degree of warming of the West Antarctic Peninsula, and that's still around in that region. Do you have any thoughts on those things?
So on the IceCube project with the neutrino detection, what happens, as I understand it, is as the neutrinos go through the ice, they emit light, and that can be detected by these sensors.
Sure.
One thing I can say about the sea ice is, we witnessed a pretty big example of unusual melting while I was there. The planes that bring people to and from Antarctica land on the sea ice, on the ice runway. And that is quite a ways from the station. It's about a half hour, 45-minute ride over the ice on a road that's maintained. The runway is maintained by heavy equipment. There's I believe, fuel line that goes out there from the station and so on. And one winter that I was down there in the spring, I believe it was, ice started breaking off in huge chunks, and we could see them floating by the station as the water opened up. Some of the road to the ice runway at the airfield broke off and drifted by, and they had to move it back farther from the edge. And it was really amazing seeing all these very huge blocks of ice moving by.
Yeah. Can you sort of give us something of a sense of the size of the Antarctic continent?
So the Antarctic continent is very large. The entire United States would fit easily within it. Of course, the land area, if you include the ice, gets bigger in the winter and smaller in the summer. McMurdo Station is on a island off the mainland coast of Antarctica. And it's an island that has an active volcano on it. Getting off track a little bit here, but you can climb Observation Hill. It's a short climb up from the station. You can get a good look down over the station. But if you look toward the volcano, if it's clear, you can see smoke coming off out of the volcano.
Something just occurred to me. You said, and that was very interesting, you interacted with the scientists who are down there. Did you have any impression that the scientists who were researching Antarctica were sort of thinking about the planet as a whole or not?
I'm pretty sure they were all thinking about the planet as a whole.
Was there any discussion on that?
Not specifically that I remember, but I'm sure there were some discussions on what was going on around the world at the time. Of course, this was 2010 through 2014 that I was down there. Global warming was not nearly as bad then as it is now. And of course, the pace of global warming is accelerating, as I'm sure you know.
Yes, it sure is. I think that's all my questions, so thanks.
Ray, we had on a program at the beginning of the year a group of folks who have this very ambitious project to look at the feasibility of a sea ice curtain surrounding the Thwaites Doomsday Glacier. And it was a particularly exciting program because one of the scientists involved actually came to us sort of live from a ship that was docked or off of the coast. Do you know anything about that program? Were you in touch with any of those people?
I was not in touch with any of those people, but I have heard about the program.
Is that something when you guys are talking and working deep in the heart of Antarctica, is that something you talk about, how the continent is changing, or is that you're so focused on the particular projects?
No, we did talk about that. And one example of building ice thickness, your discussion about what they were doing brought to mind the ice pier where the ships dock at McMurdo Station. What they do is in the wintertime, they will build a snow berm around what in the summer becomes the pier, and they will pump seawater up on top of it and let it freeze. They will keep doing that all winter to make the ice pier thicker. And of course, that pier is tethered to the shore. It has some steel cables reinforcing it and so on. But they need it to be thick enough and strong enough that you can, have big trucks driving on it across a short bridge from the shore. Ships need to come up to it and dock and so on. So they have to build up the thickness of the ice there so that it doesn't melt throughout the summer.
I see. That's quite an engineering feat. I guess it wouldn't be much of an engineering feat in a normal climate, but everything is challenging and has to be thought of 2 or 3 times with extra safety protocols in such an environment.
Yeah, there's a lot of safety protocols and issues that we run into down there. We had an incident kind of late in the winter one year where at the South Pole, where we get all of our water from what they call a rod well. And a rod well is something where they bore a hole in the ice and then they start pumping. And of course, this is all ice from fresh water, from snow and so on. And so they bore a hole and they start pumping hot water down this from the station. And that creates liquid water down at the bottom. And then they put a hose and a pipe and a cable down there and they start pumping water out a couple gallons more than they pump down there. And that's how the South Pole Station gets their water. And late in the winter, one year, the pump quit. And so they tried to get it out and repair it or replace it, but it got stuck in the hole and they couldn't get it out. So they had the backup was melting snow. So they had to load snow into a metal container that had hot liquid pumped around it and insulated and so on to get water. And then that's how we got water for the rest of the winter. And, we were limited to one short shower every other week and other water rationing until the crew from the States could come in and get the problem solved.
Yeah, but it's been quite a few years or decades that these facilities have been there so that you've been able to develop all sorts of protocols for safety and deal with almost any eventuality, I assume. Let me turn it over to Paul for our sort of second and last round. Paul?
I understand, yeah, the base, the mid 50s was when the base started something called the International Geophysical Year in 56. I think that was the impetus. And interestingly, the small nuclear reactor powered it, and then diesel generators put in, I think a lot of it is now wind power. There's all kinds of logistics. It's like a whole community that's completely isolated from the rest of the world. You can't go many places on our planet and have that sort of situation. So the neutrino observatory is quite interesting because, in Canada and Sudbury, we have something called the Snow Lab. That's not snow, that's SNO, Sudbury Neutrino Observatory. And that's deep down under bedrock, and there's a pool of heavy water. I mean, basically, you want to filter and get rid of some of the weakest neutrinos. You want to block everything else. and then just get the neutrinos will penetrate pretty much anything. And I mean, that's what is being done, I think, with the continent of Antarctica and the ice. The neutrinos are about the only thing that goes through all that. Everything else is blocked off. I mean, they've also done a lot of ozone studies. When we had the ozone scare, the studies down there, cosmic rays from the solar wind. I guess you get volcanologists because Mount Erebus is only 25 kilometers or miles away and it's an active volcano. Apart from all of the climate work, the West Antarctic ice sheet and the drilling projects with the hot water, they also look at it's a great place to find meteorites. It just fascinates me. You get a huge interaction of all of these different scientists down there studying different things. And there are runways, but probably the weather is really bad certain times of the year. You can't have planes coming in. So there's an awful lot of logistics. I mean, like I say, are you aware of NASA doing much work down there to try to figure out how to support people that are completely isolated from the rest of us?
I haven't heard of NASA work, but as far as support in the wintertime, there was at least one midwinter evacuation from McMurdo Station when I was down there. And it took a couple weeks to get the runway prepared and so on. It was a major event. When I was at the South Pole, there had never been a midwinter evacuation. One winter before I was down there, somebody got cancer and couldn't get off the continent, so they dropped medical supplies and equipment, but that was the best they could do until spring. Since then, I understand there has been a midwinter evacuation from the South Pole, but I don't know the details of that. One thing I wanted to say about the history of McMurdo, you mentioned originally there was a nuclear reactor there. My first winter down there, the floor for that reactor building was still there. And by the second winter, it was gone. And so that is something that, I got to witness at least a little piece of that. And then you talked about wind energy down there. The first winter I was down there was the first year that the New Zealand station had 2 wind turbines. They were kind of halfway between New Zealand station and McMurdo. They're very close together. People visited back and forth and so on. But the issue with the wind turbines is if the wind drops suddenly, then they have what they call a power store, which is a flywheel running in a vacuum that can hold up the power for about 15 seconds, which is often long enough to get another generator started. But sometimes a feeder is dropped and then you have to get another generator started and synchronized and so on. So that created some challenges until they got that worked out. It was down a lot. The wind turbines were down a lot the first winter they were in, and then they improved quite a bit. But that gave us challenges on things like the waste heat, where when the wind was blowing, we didn't have much waste heat off the generators that we used to heat the major buildings. When the wind stopped blowing, we had a lot. One of the things I accomplished while I was there is because of the way they were controlling getting this heat to the different buildings, a lot of the times the loop temperature got too low to transfer heat into the buildings. So building furnaces had to run to generate and so on. I kind of revamped that whole control system since my background is controls. When I left there, radiators were cold all winter because we used all of that heat.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Peter?
This may not fit in with this session, but I said that I took a look whether there was anything interesting with regards to Antarctica. And I found some most important research, which I'd missed. I'm sure Paul knows about it. To put it simply, the researchers looked into the effect of meltwater of Antarctica. It's quite extraordinary because apparently scientists haven't looked into any sort of change regionally around Antarctica that the meltwater does, apart from add more water. What they found is that there are big changes in the circulation around Antarctica, and now these include feedbacks, and I've always been very interested in feedbacks. What they're describing is a positive feedback, so they're describing an amplifying feedback. They said that if and when these feedbacks were fed into the science, it could make a very, very big difference to the assessment of the whole global sea level rise situation.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly to Peter. If the AMOC in the northern hemisphere shuts off, then the Arctic will go much colder, but Antarctica will warm significantly. In terms of sea level rise with the continent, it's only 10 meters above sea level, the station, but as there's more ice melt off Antarctica, there's isostatic rebound. The whole continent moves up. So the effective sea level at the coast of Antarctica can actually drop, even though global sea level rise is increasing. So there's a lot of these interesting factors. Also, the circulation of the water around the continent, the circumpolar ocean currents have a large impact on relative sea level rise at that location too. So there's a lot going on, which is fascinating.
So I'd like to say one final word about my background. I'm very active with the Climate Restoration Alliance and working with the Eddy Carbon Research Group to start a pilot project toward climate restoration in October of this year.
Well, that's great news to hear. I know a number of us have been involved with climate restoration for quite a while. So we welcome you aboard, and any work that we can all do to accelerate that is essential for the small issue of the survival of humanity. So on that note, any last words you'd like to say, Ray?
So I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to talk. This has been a very interesting discussion. I look forward to continuing my climate restoration work.
Thank you for being with us, a really important show. And from there, we will go on to the Climate 3. So back to the world of heat and humidity from the world of Antarctica. And this is a perennial story in the summertime. The latest in the last few days or so, as this is being recorded, the heat and the heat waves and the fires continue in Europe, particularly in France and in Spain. And there is a phenomena that I cannot pronounce, but I will try, and hopefully somebody will fix what I say. Pyrocumulonimbus. Clouds are created, which basically it's an unprecedented condition in France where the fires themselves and create the atmosphere through the thunderstorms and whatever to change the weather itself. In other words, you begin to get a self-perpetuating change in the climate in those areas where the wildfires are occurring. This shows the intensity and the unprecedented nature. There are hundreds of thousands of people that have been evacuated. We will have a program on it next week because it remains such a critical issue. On the other hand, if you go to Brazil, Brazil just announced that in 2024, they had the lowest amount of fires in or land that was burned in the Amazon for over 40 years. Still a lot, 3 million hectares, whereas the year before was 15 million. So it decreased by 80%. And that's probably, I would guess, I haven't done the calculations, considerably more than all the hectares that are burned in Europe. So it's just a reminder, this climate is a worldwide phenomena. What happens in one place, as horrible as it may be, and it's not an excuse for not acting on it, we really have to look at the whole picture, which is very difficult to do because the world is a big place. And a couple other things of note there, and that is, and this is particularly sad, I think many of us feel this way when we hear about animals in particular that are suffering. Camels in Africa are dying at unprecedented levels. Now, when camels die from heat, you know it's severe. Something like 46% of the households in one part of Ethiopia reported that their camels were dying more than usual from dehydration, from infections. And basically, even camels apparently are not acclimated to handle the heat that we're now experiencing, much less than we will experience. And the third thing I want to mention, or actually quote, some of you may know, particularly those of you who are our British viewers, that the Daily Telegraph is hardly a friend of climate action in the UK. And yet I want to read what a columnist said just a couple days ago for the Daily Telegraph. And I think I'm going to quote this entire statement that he made because it's so important. And his name is Tim Stanley. And he said, "I'm coming to the view that the online right is going wrong, eschewing compassion or charm talking itself into corners of angry irrelevance. Take climate change. This is no longer a matter of speculation. The wildfires of Europe, pitiless and persistent, are the way we live now. Global warming, yes, we can call it that, is killing things that conservatives claim to love. Farming, rural tradition, millions of French chickens, the poor things practically boiled alive. Europe is thought to have lost around 10 million tons of forecast grain production just in the last month, which will mean greater imports and higher prices. Capitalism does not thrive in an apocalypse. Here in the UK, we've endured the 3 worst harvests on record in the last 6 years, and in England received only 3% of the typical rainfall in the first 3 weeks of July. It is bizarre that while the politics of agriculture has focused on taxes, the actual business is threatened by a phenomena that some bloggers still think is a hoax. And Tim concludes by saying the renewable revolution is very much happening, making its hardcore opponents in the right look very silly, still boosting fossil fuels as the secret sauce of a philosophy of boundless growth that is at its heart unconservative. I thought that was one of the best statements I've ever seen. How significant that is, whether he is someone who has changed his mind or what. But I think we need to hear more of that from the right, because until the right starts recognizing it, there's only so much the rest of us can do. So with that, I want to thank you, Ray, for being with us today and for all your wonderful work in Antarctica on climate restoration and everything else. And as always, our thanks to Paul and Peter, and we will see you next week. Thank you very much. Goodbye.